I want to bring in Peter Baker, New York Times chief White House correspondent and an MS Now contributor. Catherine Rampell is co-host of the evening edition of MS Now's The Weekend and the economics editor for The Bulwark. With me here in studio, MS Now senior legal reporter Lisa Rubin. So, Lisa, what do we know about this investigation and also the timing?
So, Chris, we understand that the investigation was started around November, but it wasn't until Friday that the Fed itself received subpoenas. MS Now has confirmed the existence of this investigation that is emanating from the Department of Justice's District of D.C. That's the office controlled by Jeanine Pirro, who's the U.S. attorney there. And we understand that what it centers on...
We should say Jeanine Pirro, a huge supporter of the president.
That is correct. But I will also say, unlike some of her colleagues in the job, has been Senate confirmed to that position. And so one of the defenses here can't be that Jeanine Pirro is illegitimately acting as a U.S. attorney. Notwithstanding that, what we understand the crux of the investigation to be is that Jerome Powell, when he testified before Congress in June, made certain misrepresentations about the Fed's renovations. We don't know which particular representations he made are alleged to have been false or misleading, but that right now seems to be the basis for this investigation against Jerome Powell.
Catherine, how unprecedented is this battle? Is this investigation? Is Jerome Powell's response? And what could be the impact?
It's all extraordinary. So it is the case that in previous eras, the president of the United States had tried to exert political influence on the chair of the Federal Reserve. We saw it in the 1970s, and it's why we had stagflation for that period, or at least it was a major contributor. Since then, presidents have generally been good about respecting the independence of the Federal Reserve, even when they did not like the policies adopted by the Fed. The Volcker era, which started under Jimmy Carter, actually, but is mostly associated with Ronald Reagan, was the period when the Federal Reserve won back its credibility, which was hard fought. And since then, it has been basically treated with the respect and independence it deserves. This time around, Jerome Powell and others on the Fed have been unwilling to do what President Trump wants them to do for political reasons. He wants them basically to cut interest rates, regardless whether that is in their best judgment for the health of the economy. And as a result, Donald Trump is doing what you're seeing. He has invented what appears to be completely fabricated charges against Jay Powell. It's bizarre in its timing in that Powell is on his way out, at least as chair, in a few months anyway. So this seems like it's purely motivated by vindictiveness. Now, note that Donald Trump is in the midst of determining who his next pick would be for the Federal Reserve chair. He had chosen Jay Powell himself, as you may recall, in his first term. Trump is in the middle of determining who he wants to succeed Powell. And I think there's a very good chance that these efforts to politicize the Fed, to persecute and prosecute Jay Powell could backfire and make it a lot harder for Trump to get his preferred choice into that seat. We've already seen a number of lawmakers, Republican senators, push back and say, no, we should investigate the DOJ now. Murkowski said that. And Thom Tillis, who sits on the banking committee, has said he will not move forward any Trump-nominated picks for the chair or otherwise, presumably, for the Federal Reserve, unless this is resolved.
Yeah, and you have to question whether someone who might be able to get confirmed might say, I don't want any part of this right now. So, Peter, NBC News asked the president about Powell being served with subpoenas, and he said he didn't know anything about it. He disputed the suggestion. It's a pressure campaign to get Powell to lower interest rates. Quote, no, I wouldn't even think of doing it that way. What should pressure him is the fact that rates are far too high. That's the only pressure he's got. Of course, the past couple of months arguably tell a different story.
He's not a smart person. I don't even think he's that political. I think he hates me, but that's okay. You know, he should. He should. I call him every name in the book, trying to get him to do something. We have a bad Fed chairman, really bad. If he would lower the rates, and I tried being nice to the guy, it doesn't help. He's like a knucklehead. No, he's a knucklehead. A stupid guy.
We have an incompetent head of the Fed. He's incompetent. I call him Jerome Too Late. He's always too late. Jerome Too Late Powell. but he's out of there in another couple of months. We'll be very happy about that.
Give us a reality check of this relationship, Peter, and the idea that the president thinks that he didn't know what he was doing when they were redoing the Fed.
Yeah, look, if Jay Powell is a stupid, knucklehead, incompetent, well, who's responsible for putting him there? That was Donald Trump. He was Donald Trump's pick, as we just said. And so, if anybody has responsibility, then it would be, you would think, the president. Look, when he says, I don't know anything about it, let's remember he says that all the time about things we know he knows plenty about. He said on that same plane, I remember back in his first term, gosh, I don't know anything about those Michael Cohen payments to Stormy Daniels. Of course, he signed checks reimbursing Michael Cohen. So when he says he doesn't know anything about it, take it with a grain of salt. I think this is one of these situations where, other than maybe the most diehard MAGA people, I don't think anybody, Republican or Democrat, thinks this is anything other than what it looks like, which is, of course, a pressure campaign. It's not a coincidence that one more adversary of the president now faces a criminal prosecution. Amazing how in the last year, only adversaries of the president face criminal prosecution. Nobody who actually is loyal to the president faces any kind of criminal investigation. But you've got Jim Comey, you've got Letitia James, you've got John Bolton, you've got plenty of others. Whether there's any merits to this or not, obviously, we don't know. We don't know what the issue is or what the allegation is specifically, but the political context is inescapable. And I think the problem for the president is, even if, in fact, there were ever legitimate concerns about any of these people he's targeted, it's always going to look political because he's made it very clear he wants the Justice Department and the FBI to be his political instruments in this term.
Yeah, add to that, the people who have been loyal to him, who have been convicted of crimes, have often been pardoned. But back to this, Lisa, of course, it's one thing to get subpoenas. It's another thing to get an indictment. Take a look at Letitia James. Take a look at Jim Comey. How do you assess this case, at least what we know about it at this early stage?
I think it would depend, Chris, on looking at the actual testimony that Jay Powell gave in June of last year and seeing what specifically about it the administration believes is false and misleading so as to constitute the crime of giving false testimony to Congress. We do know from AP reporting that the renovation of the Fed has, at this point, been roughly $600 million over budget. But that same Associated Press reporting says one of the reasons that it could be so over budget is because of the Trump administration's own insistence on using premium grade marble to renovate the Fed and other federal buildings, as opposed to the Fed, which has a lot of glass involved. They're also doing an underground garage to make the Fed more modernized. So I think it really depends on parsing the precise words. But I want to talk about timing, if I can, for a second, because one of the other people who is a perceived enemy of President Trump, who has not yet been prosecuted, but who he has tried to fire, is another member of the Fed, Lisa Cook. And next week, next Wednesday in particular, Lisa Cook and Donald Trump's administration will square off at the Supreme Court over the question of whether Trump has the right to fire a member of the Fed for anything less than cause. And the specific definition of cause, it's what's at issue. Lisa Cook says that the alleged mortgage fraud that she has been accused of doesn't count as cause, in part because it happened before she was seated as a member of the Fed. By contrast, the allegations that they're now airing against Jerome Powell have to do with things that he did and said while he was on the job. It's almost as if they have tailored this investigation to meet the legal objections that Lisa Cook and her lawyers have raised and so far succeeded in. And because of that, it looks a little bit suspicious in hindsight that they are almost trying to engineer an investigation to meet the confines of the statute. It's clear that cause doesn't mean what Michael Scott used to joke around that it meant on The Office. He would say, it's because I hate him. Personal animus is not the same as for-cause rationale to remove a member of the Fed from office.
Great reference, by the way. Okay, Catherine, I remember you spoke to Powell shortly after Election Day in 2024 about what would happen if the Fed's independence was compromised. Here's what he said.
We've seen it here in the United States in the 1970s, actually, and it's not a pretty picture. So, I think this is very widely, by the way, understood and supported. I've spent a lot of time on Capitol Hill, and I think where it really matters on both sides of Capitol Hill, the Senate and the House, in both political parties, there's a broad understanding that an independent central bank is very important in just serving the public as best we can. We're not perfect. Everyone makes mistakes, but you'll get the best results if you have people who are just focused on that task and separate from politics.
Separate from politics, so far today, the markets have been mixed. I mean, the Dow down just a bit, 93 points, 94 points. Former Fed Chair Janet Yellen said herself today, I'm surprised the market isn't more concerned. It seems to me that the market should be concerned. Are you surprised given what's at stake?
Certainly, there is a lot at stake. And in the long run, this would be horrendous for the U.S. economy if, in fact, the president of the United States succeeds in politicizing the central bank. We have seen this story before. I mentioned the stagflation in the 1970s. That's also what Chair Powell referred to in that clip that you just played. But we've seen it in Venezuela, Argentina, Turkey, pre-Euro Italy, Zimbabwe. There are lots of places around the world where the central bank, the money supply, has been put under the purview of politicians, and that has resulted in horrific inflationary outcomes, and everyone pays the price. As to the question as to why markets do not seem to be flipping out yet, I think that might be the fact that we've seen some strong pushback so far from Republicans on Capitol Hill. As you played in that clip, Jerome Powell said in that interview back in November of 2024, essentially that he thought lawmakers had his back. I've been skeptical that that would be the case, precisely given the fact that Republican lawmakers, have been unwilling to stand up to Donald Trump when it comes to, obviously, a lot of his other personnel decisions, not to mention other erratic behaviors and potentially unlawful behaviors. But in this case, their wallets are at stake. Their donors' wallets are at stake. So it may be with good reason that they are extra motivated to stand up for the independence of the Federal Reserve.